Welcome to End of Life University on YouTube. In this episode, I'm sharing with you a conversation I had with my husband, Dr. Larry George, and we're talking about my new book that's out. This is just the proof version, so it still has a gray line on it. Stories from the Dark Night, Writing as a Tool for Grief. And we have a really great conversation. I think you'll enjoy that. So stay tuned. Be sure and subscribe down below if you haven't already. Subscribe and leave a rating and review wherever you happen to listen to the podcast. And go to eoluniversity.com/support if you're willing and able to make a small contribution to help keep this show on the air. So we'll move on to my conversation with my husband, Dr. Larry George. Welcome to End of Life University podcast, where we share real talk about life and death. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wyatt, and today is episode number 423. This is a really special episode because, as my guest and co-host, I'm welcoming my husband, Dr. Larry George, and we're really excited to have a conversation together. And Larry is a family practice physician like me. We met each other back when we were residents training to be doctors. Now retired, but he is also one of the founders of integral medicine, which is based on Ken Wilber's integral model. And someday the two of us will have to have another conversation about that and explain the importance and the value of integral medicine when we're looking at patient-centered care, but that's for another time. So now I want to welcome you, Larry, to being my guest on my podcast.
Thank you. And I'd like to just add that integral medicine is, as you said, based on the work of Ken Wilber, but it's completely different from integrative medicine, which is a much more common, popular term. But that's for another time.
Yeah, but that's a really good point, and that is something we would really love to talk about, that actually, like integral medicine and the end of life. So we'll have a reprise of this of our conversation someday in the future, and we'll go into that.
And I look forward to it.
Yeah, but today Larry, you've agreed to join me here to talk a little bit about my newest book that just came out as we record this. It's just coming out today, I guess, actually, as it's being recorded. And I still have the proof version that has this little gray line on it, but it's called Stories from the Dark Night. And so you agreed to help me talk about it, and in some ways take over being the host and ask me questions. And I thank you so much for being willing to do that.
Oh, my pleasure. I love this book. Maybe we could start by talking about your experience of grief and what that was like for you.
Yeah, and this is something, I mean, I talk a lot on this podcast about the fact that my father died from suicide. I don't always talk about what that grief journey was like, and you know it well because you lived through all of it too. And we were both in our early 30s when my dad died. We'd been married for, I think, about 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, something like that.
And we had 2 little children, a 2-year-old and a 4-month-old, when my dad died by suicide. And
Yeah,
it
we
was
were
absolutely,
practiced together.
yeah, we were in medical practice together, and it was actually devastating for both of us because you really loved my dad too and felt really close to my dad.
Yeah, he was such an important person to me. Not having the most loving and terrific father in my own life, I was really missing having a father figure in my life. And your dad was just fit the bill perfectly. He was just such a wonderful man. He was smart, self-educated, funny, very skilled in terms of his car mechanics and hunting and fishing, and taught me a lot about things that I never had a father figure to, to teach me. And I was just thinking that um, the strongest memories that I have of my medical practice were negative things. And one that pops into mind was this beautiful trans teenager um, woman that ended up taking her own life. And those kinds of things haunt my memories of medical practice. But a very significant one was when we got the call that your father had taken his life. And
Yeah,
just
we were both at work that day in
right,
the medical clinic, both in our offices seeing patients. Our 4-month-old baby was in the office because I was bringing her into the office with me to
right,
breastfeed, and had a babysitter there who was helping me take care of her in the office. And it was just the most like shocking, stunning thing I could even imagine. I mean, I, someone came to the door and said, "You have a phone call," and her face was completely white. And she said, "It's your brother." And I knew right away something's wrong because he wouldn't call me in the
right.
middle of a clinic day. And I never went back to see that patient. I never finished seeing the patient. I just walked out. It was like, and it's as if everything kind of came to a halt. The entire world stopped that moment. And then we entered into this kind of surreal time for a long time after that, of dealing with the aftermath of this horrible news.
Yeah, just feeling completely numb, and just it just didn't seem real. It was awful, you know, having recently found a father figure in my life, and then to lose him so shockingly, it was really devastating for me as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, shockingly, my dad was kind of my role model in life. Like, he was the person I wanted to be like. His integrity, just his outlook on life, I guess, the way he saw things. And I always felt like we were a lot alike. And so I just had always expected that he would be there, and I'd get to see him grow old and learn about aging, and growing closer to death gradually, and keep learning from him as I went. But all that was taken away in an instant. And also just so shocking that he made that choice to end his own life, and there was nothing that we could do to change that.
Yeah, I also grieved for the fact that our children would grow up without a grandfather, and especially such a special guy that he was, and what a wonderful grandfather he would have been to our kids, and teaching them about the outdoors. And so there was that level of grief as well. That
Yeah, just so many losses, one thing after another, um,
yeah,
that came to mind. And I realized, like, I never really quite had a grasp on my grieving process until so many years later, when I can look back on it. I finally understand it a little bit better. But I realize now that for about 3 years, I um I just repressed grief. I couldn't really deal with my grief because I was a here I was a doctor, in full-time medical practice, a mom with a 2-year-old and a 4-month-old breastfeeding. I was still, in postpartum, going through all the emotional swings of having just given birth, and being a wife, being a homemaker, all of those things. It was so overwhelming. The rest of my life was overwhelming enough, but to add this devastating grief on top of it, I didn't really feel like I had the space to actually even process the grief. And I think what I did was I just kept going through my life. We took 1 week off to go back for my dad's funeral, and both of us came back and went right back to work. And There was no time to sit and think about the grief or process the loss, even for you and I to talk about it together. I don't think we did that very often.
I think that's common though in grief, you're so stunned and in shock that you really can't process. And sometimes, at least for me, that work was a great diversion from having to face that pain.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I think, me personally, I buried that for a long time. But as you know, I grieved for about 20 years after my mother died when I was 12. So I was very familiar with having to grieve the loss of a parent, and being older was actually helpful, being an adult when dealing with a loss of a parent.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Versus being 12 years old.
yeah, it was impossible to. I didn't even start my grief process until 20 years later. So
Yeah.
it's just really common, as you know,
Yeah.
to,
I
to have
think
to shelve it.
I remember about 3 years after dad died was when our oldest child, our son, went into kindergarten, and our daughter was in preschool, and that was actually the first time in all those years that I had 1 or 2 days a week when I had a few hours in the morning to myself when I didn't work. I was I was taking a couple of days a week off from work then, and I actually had time when I wasn't in the clinic or wasn't doing something with our kids to myself. And I think that's actually when the grief hit me. That's actually when I started
Yeah,
processing it, when I had those little moments of time and solitude. And it's also right after that, I started volunteering in hospice, and I decided to quit doing family medicine. I made a huge shift
right.
because getting into hospice is actually what made me realize, like, I have to do something. I have to look at this grief and this pain that I'm carrying, and hospice became a way for me to do that. And that's when I think I really started the grief process.
Well, your book is all about writing as a means to deal with grief. So when did you start writing as a way to deal with that? Is
Well,
it same time as hospice? I don't recall.
no, well, earlier than that, I had read Julia Cameron's book, The Artist's Way, and she recommended doing morning pages, is what she calls it, getting up
Yeah, I
first thing in the
remember that.
morning and writing whatever your thoughts are. And so during those 3 years when I was not processing my grief or talking about it, I started doing morning pages. And I don't know if I even recognized that it was grief that was trying to come
Yeah,
out, that was boiling up inside of me. But I just knew I would get up really early, some days 4:30 in the morning before our kids would wake up, and sit downstairs and write my 3 morning pages. And it was all free form writing, just writing whatever came in my head, whatever was there, and write. I would write nonstop, 3 pages.
mm,
Sometimes it was just gibberish. Other times something really profound would come out as I wrote. But I realized that kind of saved me. Those were the days when I was really repressing my grief. I didn't want to talk about it because I didn't think I could keep functioning if I did. I thought if I directly look at this grief and feel the pain, I can't work as a doctor. I can't see patients in the office and hear their stories. I
right.
can't even be a mom to our kids. So that's why I knew, like, I have to keep this locked inside. But those morning pages, that actually became the time when I would just ventilate. It was like just putting anything out there on paper that was coming up inside of me. And I think that saved me a little bit because I got some of that tension and emotion out first thing in the morning before the day started. I
Yeah,
realized too, if at any time during the day when things would start to come to the surface, I could repress it again and think to myself, tomorrow morning, in the morning pages, I'll be able to write about this. So I always had that outlet every day. And that I really think that saved me during those years.
yeah. I'm curious. Are there studies that show that writing is a good tool for grief? Has that been looked at very much?
Yeah, there have been some studies that I read about for creating this book. And one in particular looked at this idea of expressive writing, which was more a free form writing, but with the intent of writing about deeper emotions. And they found that just 15 minutes a day of that kind of writing was really helpful and reduced anxiety and depression for people. And so I really believe that because I think it was very effective for me. And I use the morning pages pattern is that you write 3 pages, 3 full pages. And when you're done with 3, you stop at that point. And it probably took me longer than 15 minutes, but it was a really helpful session. So some of the other things that they've written about from studies is that um, excuse me, writing about grief, for one thing, it validates your experience. And I do remember that in the beginning, grief doesn't feel real. That part of your mind has a really hard time grasping that this actually happened. And I don't know if you experienced that too, but for me, there would be days when I would think, wait, is that real? Was that a dream? Am I imagining this? Did it really happen? And like writing about it reminds you, yes,
Mhm.
this person really died. This is real. The
Yeah.
pain that's there is real.
Yeah, we both know this from our research and reading that um, strong emotion cuts off access to your higher consciousness, and it's kind of buried. So um, it sounds like writing is a way to kind of reconnect with that emotional pain that gets cut off by the intensity of the emotion. So, are there different types of writing or writing styles that have been used for grief?
Yeah, the first one that I described was just free form writing, which was studied
Pages.
a lot, and especially the free form writing about emotions. What's really good about that type of writing is there's no judgment, there's no pressure. You don't have to have any skill at writing or think of yourself as a writer. You just take a spiral notebook and a pen and you just write anything down. And so anyone and everyone can do it. And even people who may feel shy or think of themselves as not a good writer, that doesn't matter because that's not what it's about. It's not about skill or anything. It's simply expressing what you're carrying inside. And I think for me that was the most helpful writing in the very beginning. And
Yeah,
one of the reasons was, as I said, I was holding back fully experiencing all of this pain because I just didn't have enough room or space in my life for it. And at the time, I couldn't really talk about it either. I didn't talk to anyone
yeah,
about my dad's death. I couldn't even say the word suicide at that time. I couldn't say it. It was too devastating to me.
yeah,
And so the writing was the only place where anything to do with grief could
yeah,
come out and be expressed. So that's the free form writing. But
yeah.
another thing that has been looked at is the
But
idea.
I just wanted
Oh,
to
go ahead.
say
Yeah.
um, that that fits perfectly with what I was saying earlier, that extreme emotional pain cuts off your higher consciousness, that if you write in a stream of consciousness way, you also bypass that higher consciousness, your cognitive thinking. And so it kind of makes sense that, especially early on when you're in such pain and you have cut off your access to higher consciousness, that free form writing, it makes perfect sense that that would be a great access to the emotional pain that's buried beneath.
Yeah, that makes sense too, because you can't rely like on your rational mind because this
It's
death
cut
is so
off.
irrational.
Yeah, it's cut off.
Yeah. And the death itself is irrational. You can't use your rational mind to explain it or understand it or even find meaning in it. You're just lost in the confusion of it all. Like,
Right.
why did this happen? What's happening? What is going on? And will this go away? And I wonder if I have it here. there was a quote I used in the book from William Shakespeare, and he said something about sorrow must be given words. And and I realized that's what freeform writing is, just allowing sorrow to be expressed through whatever words it chooses, whatever words choose to come out of you.
Yeah.
Eh,
So what other kinds of writing
Well,
techniques, styles?
one that has also been looked at is the idea of writing letters. And I know you've used this as well. We both have.
Yeah.
You can write a letter to the person who died, which is a really great way of expressing your
Mm.
emotions to that person, because always there are things that weren't said that you wish you had said. The thing.
Especially painful things.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, sometimes negative things that you couldn't say,
Yeah.
but you could put anything into a letter to that person, and it is, in a sense, a way of finally having the relief of being able to say it. But you can also write a letter to yourself. You can write a letter to your younger self, to your current self, or future self.
Your
Uh,
wounded self.
yeah, your wounded self, about healing, and you know you could write a letter to your wounded self, in a sense, from your higher self, saying, we're going to get through this. This hurts like crazy, but we're going to survive it. We're going to make it. We'll
Mhm.
get there one way or another.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and I remember, as part of when you and I first got introduced to doing inner child work, that was such a powerful
Yeah.
exercise. I know we wrote letters with our left hand because it recreated being a child who was just learning how to write. And
Also, theoretically, if you write with most people being right-handed, if you write with your left hand, it accesses the right side of the brain, which is more intuitive and feeling, whereas the left side is, uh, more commonly the rational, logical side. And so you sort of bypass, again, much like free-form writing, you bypass the higher rational consciousness and go directly to the underlying emotion. So yeah, that can be really effective.
And I think another important thing about that bypassing is that we also each have like our inner critic that we need to bypass sometimes, because when we start writing about these really deep and painful emotions, that part of us oftentimes will rise up and either tell us, don't say that, or why are you writing about this? You don't have any right to say that. It will start judging and criticizing everything that we're putting on paper, which can become an obstacle too.
Yeah. What other writing styles or techniques?
Well, poetry is one thing, though,
Mm.
I mean, most of us would struggle to write poetry, me included, because I'm not trained to write poetry. I don't know that much about poetry. But what was really interesting to me is that I did write poetry during these years, not in the early years, but I started finding like there would be days when I would wake up and I would have a poem, what seemed to be a poem that was in my head, and I would write it down. And
Yeah.
sometimes I realize the value of poetry is that it uses fewer words, just a few words, and also relies a lot on symbolism.
Yeah.
And sometimes I didn't fully even understand what the poem was trying to say. I didn't
Mm.
even get it, that there were deeper layers of meaning. I
Yeah.
just wrote it down, what was in my
Yeah.
head. It came out as a poem, but always those poems later, I could go back and look at it and think, oh, wow, that has a double meaning. There's something
Yeah.
more to that poem than I
Yeah.
realized.
Poetry is a lot like dream work in that sense that there are many levels of interpretation, and as you said, the economy of words, that each word has so much more depth of meaning than if you're just writing prose or free form writing, very concise and to the point, and also probably similarly um, bypassing rational a little bit because you're just sort of putting out powerful words that occur to you.
Yeah, and I remember I was surprised that I'm writing down poems, because I'd never written poetry, or never aspired to be a poet or write poetry, but for whatever reason, it's like the way my subconscious maybe was bringing forward messages that I needed to hear.
Yeah.
And it's true, like those poems stuck with me. I kept them in a notebook and I could go back and reread them. And I remember one poem in which the last the last line of the poem was a question for my dad, you know, at and it was basically describing at the moment that you were ready to take your life. Did you know what would be undone? And I've looked at that so many times and I realized, oh, undone has multiple meanings. What was undone in what wasn't finished in his life as being not done, what he didn't get to finish, what he and I didn't get to finish together, what he didn't finish with our grandchildren, but also undone as in taken apart and unraveled and shattered in a way. Did you know how much would be shattered and destroyed when you took your own life? And there
Yeah.
was a bit of bitterness and anger in there at my dad. Like, did you know how devastating this was going to be
Yeah.
to all the rest of us? And I think that was the first time I saw that I was really angry at him. I had not been able to
Mm.
experience that or express it or admit to myself that I was angry. But when that poem came out, I saw it so clearly in
Mhm.
that question at the end of the poem.
Well, your book is just filled with beautiful stories, and you're such a great storyteller. Obviously, that must be another writing technique to use for grief. It seems to me a more advanced technique. Tell me
Yeah,
more about that.
yeah. Well, what happened for me, I guess I've always thought of myself, I guess I use the word story gatherer as someone who I love stories. And so I kind of see life through stories. And when like patients in the office, when they start telling me something, telling me about something that
Yeah.
happened or their symptoms, it's all part of a story and I keep asking them for details, but what about this and what did you do then and how, because in my mind is putting the story of it together. And so I've always just loved stories, loved gathering them, hearing them, telling them. So that comes easily to me. And one thing that I realize now, I didn't see it then, but I realize now, this devastating grief of my dad's really opened me even more to compassion for my patients and made me just so much more connected in a way to their suffering. I was fine. I was able to see what they were experiencing and share in it with them, and then also able to write the story of that suffering. So I would write stories about my patients in hospice. Those ended up in the book Seven Lessons for Living from the Dying, writing stories about patients from the family medicine clinic. And suddenly I could see within their stories, I could see little miracles that were taking place. I could see how they were growing or how life was challenging them and what they were learning about life. I could just see all these things that I had not seen as clearly before. And
Yeah.
at least somehow I was so much more open and so much more connected. So those stories kept coming to me and I would just write them down. I felt so compelled, like, oh my gosh, that's an amazing story. I have to write it down. So all along, I was gathering these stories of things that would happen with patients. Again, I wasn't aware that it was partly my grief that was helping me do that. I didn't see it then, but I see it so much more clearly now that it was part of my grieving process, that I was observing how people suffered in life and the pain they've experienced, and then how it had helped them grow or what they learned from it or how it changed them. Always, that's what the stories were always about that were coming through me.
So before moving on to the next question, are there any other writing techniques?
Yeah, one that was helpful for me is just using guided writing prompts. During the whole time while I was grieving, I went to a number of different writing workshops, and then I also joined a little writing group with just two other women, but the three of
Uh-huh.
us, we had our own writing group, and we were following a book that had writing prompts in it. And those actually really helped me because they none of them were ever about writing about grief. It wasn't a prompt about writing about my grief, but the prompts always inspired me, sometimes inspired me to write fictional stories or to do an activity and write about it. And so many times, and looking back later, I see my grief is hiding behind that story. I see the pain of grief is contained within that story, and the way I write it comes from the the part of me that's hurting, but that's trying so hard to heal and to understand
Yeah,
and to learn. And so those prompts really inspired me to write unique things that I might never have thought of to write myself. And one was to write a story from two different perspectives, from the two different characters
yeah,
who intersected at a moment in time, and
yeah,
write each of their stories up to the point of intersection. And that blew my mind. Like that, and the story that came from that was, it was
yeah,
a fictional story, but really powerful.
yeah. And from integral theory, um, taking more perspectives is associated with higher consciousness. So, that's a really powerful tool to write about different perspectives because it puts you in that higher consciousness space. So I can see that would be a really useful prompt. I loved it that you included prompts in your book after each story, um, and maybe you could tell our viewing and listening audience about some of those things.
Yeah, I decided to include it. At first I was just going to write a book and just put all these poems and stories, just stick them all in a book. But later I realized, like, they're really, when I look at them chronologically, they really show this unfolding journey of mine through grief, how I went from the beginning of not being able to say the word suicide or write about grief, or even to directly write about my dad. In the beginning, I couldn't really even write anything about him until years later. I was describing this journey of pain and my struggles to heal and my ongoing issues. I was able to just directly write about it, and writing about grief, writing about death and dying. It was phenomenal. The change that happened within my own writing process. That was something that was really amazing. And I decided I need to include some of that in this book as well. And that's what made me decide, well, I'm going to write about a little bit more didactic about how to use writing and include writing prompts in case somebody reading it is on their own journey and they would like to do more writing. Maybe the prompts will inspire them too.
I'm curious, do the prompts address different aspects of grieving? For example, when, especially after a suicide death, the guilt, I didn't do enough, I should have seen this. Your followers probably don't realize that you did a psychiatric fellowship, and in addition to family medicine and hospice. So you were treating a lot of people with depression, and are there writing prompts that specifically address things like guilt, betrayal? Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
The prompts, I tried to keep the prompts a little bit more vague, and maybe they would be a reflection of one of the pieces that was written in that section. So, for example, I wrote one about my mom called The Perfect Mother, and it's about mothers in general, but our relationships with our mothers and what those are like. And then the prompt is, are there are there ways in which your own parents were perfect for you, when what the flaws that your parents may have exhibited turned out to be perfect for you to become who you are today? Can you make that connection? So I tried to make the prompts, they're related somewhat to the things that I had written about, but I tried to make them open-ended enough so that people, if
Yeah.
someone was inspired by the prompt, they could go any direction they wanted with that, whatever came to the surface for them.
Tell me more about your journey then, in through this writing and grief.
Yeah, like I was saying initially I couldn't write anything that had any structure at all. I couldn't even tell a story. It was all just the free form writing. And then I joined that little writing group, and honestly, in all the writing groups and workshops, my grief process was never a topic. So I never really discussed with anyone that I was grieving. I know it's kind of shocking because that's like a major part of your life, but I never talked about it.
Mhm.
Um, and so I never expected to write anything about grief directly. I just wrote what came to me. And as I mentioned already, like it would be a lot of times stories that I would see or recognize in patients in the office, like so many just like heart touching stories. There's a patient of a woman um, who she had got diagnosed with breast cancer after her, or with a breast tumor after her mother died, and she was a woman of who was disadvantaged intellectually in a way, was now living on her own after her mom died. But then she had a dream that her mother came to see her and her breast tumor disappeared. It was this amazing, miraculous story. But I began to like hear all these things and see things and listen to things patients would tell me, and write those stories. So that was just one little example of that, but that started happening more and more. So I was opening more and more to gathering these stories and hearing them. At the same time, I was more and more able to become vulnerable myself. And I didn't know that until about myself until later. It was a long time before I was able to really share my own pain. I wrote about other people's pain and their journey and their process, but it was a number of years before I could write about my own pain. And there was a real breakthrough. I think it was like 11 years after my dad died. If you remember this, I went on a little retreat by myself to a hot springs, and it was on the anniversary of my dad's death. And I took all my notebooks and writing material, and it was significant that it was a hot springs because my dad and I had always gone to the hot springs in Thermopolis, Wyoming. When I was a little girl, we went there fairly often, and I got in that water, and it was like something amazing happened. But that was the first time I was ever able to just completely, fully open up my own pain and put it down on paper and really write about my
Mhm.
dad's death and missing my dad and feeling guilty and so many different things. I wrote for like 11 hours a day each
Um,
day of that retreat because I couldn't stop writing. It all
yeah.
just came out at once.
It, were you aware that writing was beneficial to your grief process before that?
No, I don't think I knew that. I don't think I recognized it. It's almost like I realize now like grief itself can be so confusing, and
No.
it dismantling in a way that it's
Mm.
very hard to recognize what's
Yeah.
happening. And it was only in retrospect and honestly putting this book together and looking through all these writings,
Yeah.
suddenly the patterns became very clear to me now. And
Mhm.
I can see how writing was so helpful as an outlet. Before, I just knew I needed to do it. I needed to do it somehow, but I didn't understand that it was therapeutic and it was really helping me.
Yeah. So how will how will readers of your book benefit from this book? If you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, um, I'm hoping for one thing that some people will read it and find catharsis, like emotional catharsis in some of the stories, because there's some really powerful
I
stories.
definitely did.
Yeah, and for people who maybe need to get in touch sometimes or open up that part of their hearts that's been closed down a little bit, it can
Sure.
be a good way to connect with that. Just reading the stories, and they're easy to read and they're fairly short. And sometimes some of them are poems, some are more essays that are written about a patient encounter, and some are short stories that are just fiction,
Yeah.
but they're easy to read. So it's a book you could just pick up for a few
Yeah.
minutes and read one story for the day and be done with it.
Yeah. Obviously, you don't have to be a skilled writer like you are to gain some of the benefits from writing to help with grief, given things like the free form writing and poetry is very personal expression. Anything more about that?
Well, also just journaling, like just writing in a journal, and where you use writing for reflection, because that's how I use a journal now. I kind of reflect back on what have I been feeling? How has that been going for me? Where did things seem to go astray? What do I
Yeah,
need to work on?
yeah,
What could I do better? And how am I growing? And what am I
yeah,
learning each day? And so all along, I continued to journal as well as do other writing in addition to it. So I highly recommend the journaling. And I was going to say another type of writing is just the idea of writing memoir and writing about what's happening to you in your own
yeah,
life experience and your life process. For me, though, it was a long time before I was able to write in that style and actually write and be vulnerable and authentic and open about what I was really feeling inside. Writing fiction or writing someone else's story was much easier for me, so I could do that earlier on.
yeah. I love it. It sounds like writing is a very gentle way to approach um, pain and suffering and grief that might be very deep and very hard to access, and that writing is a very gentle way of beginning the healing process. It seems to me.
Yeah, I'm hoping this book will be, in a sense, a validation for other people who are grieving. Partly if they can recognize this long, long journey
Yeah,
that I've recorded stories from, that healing can happen and transformation happens slowly and gradually, a few words at a time, and that it comes to you gradually. But I'm hoping people will find some inspiration in that for their own journey, to hold on and not be afraid to just put pen to paper, write down whatever
yeah,
is coming through them, because it's such a valuable means of expression. And that I give hope to people to see that how much progress can be made, that I could go
yeah,
from not even being able to talk about grief or even
yeah,
able to say the word suicide, to be
yeah,
able to write some really powerful pieces about that. And now even
yeah,
teaching, in the last couple of years, I started teaching a workshop about suicide, about my
yeah,
dad's suicide specifically. That's just how much things have
yeah.
changed, and writing has been instrumental for that. And there was one quote. This I have a quote I wanted to read, but it comes from where is it?
While you
Oh,
look
it
at that, I just wanted to say
oh
too that
yeah.
because grief is such a unique thing to each individual, it the as you know, the healing time is extremely variable, and like my grief was 20 years. That's actually took me 20 years to start the grieving
Yeah.
process.
Yeah.
It's very unique, and what I love about this in your book is that because writing is very personal, especially journaling, but all of the writing, it uniquely is a unique therapy for each individual with their own unique um, grief process and pain. So I love that about healing grief through writing. It's very um, individualistic.
Yeah. And another thing I thought of it as too is that writing, when especially in your journal, your little notebook that's just for you, it's a safe space where it's
Right,
okay to express anything. And there might be things that you would never tell another person, thoughts you've had or emotions that have arisen that you don't feel comfortable telling anyone, but you
right,
can write them.
right.
And you give yourself permission to write whatever is there. And it really helps you feel what you're feeling and allow all the feelings to be there, and then embrace them and say, hey, this is what's true and real for me right now. This is how it is. It might seem ugly, it might seem terrible to someone else, but this is the truth of what I'm experiencing.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
um One of the quotes, um oh yeah, I the from the book that says, writing allows you to experience in a safe space all of the deep and wide and terrifying and amazing and heartbreaking aspects of your own beautiful grief. And so that's, I think writing can take you to all of those edges of your grief and help you explore all of it. And the things that you're too afraid to tell a therapist, things you wouldn't maybe even talk to your partner or spouse about,
Mhm.
writing helps you, allows you to express that, and then to look back at that writing and reflect on it and think about the meaning of it.
Yeah, beautiful.
And I wanted to mention another, so I have another book that's out this week, which is The Tao of Death, which is a collection of 81 verses. They're adaptations of the Tao Te Ching. Um, one of the quotes, as I was doing the Tao of Death, I saw the connection between that book and Stories from the Dark Night, because this quote from the Tao of Death says, if you want to learn the way of death, just look deeply inside your own suffering. You'll find a precious gem hidden within its distressing disguise. And that's what I realized. As I look back at all my writings, those were the precious gems, and they were hiding inside that painful grief.
Mm.
But it requires going into the suffering in order to find the gems. You have to be willing to kind of dive into it and
Right,
experience it all, and allow it to be present.
right. Yeah, it's almost an unearthing process, you have to dig and dig and dig and
Yeah.
finally release it.
Yeah. So I guess I would hope that this book in a way could help other people with that process of feeling whatever they feel, allowing it to come to the surface, allowing it to be expressed in words, and embracing it as part of their own journey of transformation and changing and healing from their grief.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you so much for writing this book. It's very powerful, and I think your followers will absolutely love it. They're really beautiful, powerful stories, very emotive and very therapeutic.
Yeah.
Where can people find your book? How can they order
Uh,
it?
for sure, it's on Amazon, but also bookstores should be able to order it. If you take them the title "Stories from the Dark Night: Writing as a Tool for Grief." Let's see, you can't see it very well. By Karen Wyatt. The bookstores should be able to order it, but it's on Amazon as well.
Nice. Well, I think everybody should go get it because it's a beautiful book, and all of us have loss and grief and pain, and I just think this is a wonderful, soothing, gentle way to access um, the pain that we all carry. And thank you so much for writing this book.
Thanks for talking to me about it. And also for kind of, uh, you know, it helps to have you bear witness to our shared grief over my dad's death. And that, yeah, I got to say, that's been a real pretty deeply bonding experience for our relationship too, that we went through that together, and we still share our longing of like, oh gosh, if only my dad were here to see this, he would love this. We still talk about that. And
Yeah. Yeah, miss the guy still.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Well, thank you. Thank you for helping lead me in this discussion.
My pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with my husband. It was really fun for me to get to talk to him and share our thoughts and memories together. So stay tuned. I'll be back next week with another interview. Until then, take care. Bye bye.